I'd like to welcome back to the stage General Berger, Dr. Watling and the Chief of Army, who have all been introduced. And that leaves me to welcome the moderator for this panel, Ms. Geraldine Doogue AO. Now, Geraldine is a career journalist and radio and television presenter, having started in the print media just after graduating from the University of Western Australia. She moved to the ABC in 1985. She then worked across multiple stations and mediums since. Now, amongst her many pursuits, she currently co-hosts the global roaming, the show Global Roaming with Hamish McDonald, where they lead novel and topical discussions on challenging global issues. Now, this sets you up very nicely, Geraldine, to moderate today's panel of three giants from the schools of solving challenges and global issues.
Thank you very much indeed, Brett. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to try to bring my years of expertise to just rise above the sheer sort of proliferation of ideas that were there, and the officer sitting beside me said, good luck. So there's a lot to draw out, and I'm really honoured to be asked. The Chief, asked me to consider looking as a member of the public, someone who's observed the public, the communities very well, I hope, for many years, and so I'm going to try to bring that to bear. Now, what really struck me, the Chief posing this fundamental question which all speakers addressed, whether warfare remained an intrinsically human activity. That's the key thread, and I'm thrilled that it is the thread uniting today. Well, I heard of some extremely human questions posed to a former senior Australian Army man by mothers who'd lost sons in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they said to him, "Did my son die for something worthwhile?" Which is a very big question, and of course doesn't betray a quick answer. But it goes to the core of today's discussions, it seems to me, the worth of the profession of arms by humans. Is it still worthwhile for human endeavour when the allure of technology is so great? Now, the Chief said, I want you to bring your particular perspective to bear. And so I will, and one of the constituencies I didn't hear represented, if I can say it, in these marvellous presentations, was the community itself. They don't hear this rich conversation that we've been exposed to today, this internal conversation about the crucial need for adaptation that you're all emphasising, which of course is an incredibly invigorating conversation about the nature of the profession of arms, the nature of warfare. Actually, rather than terrorise us, I find it extremely inviting to hear this, and I wish the community could hear it better. Now, maybe it's seen as too threatening to share, I'm thinking about this, with the very population who wants to feel utterly safe and who assumes that there is this professional force providing a service that they can't provide, and they actually, who are on the case of national security all the time. Whereas I've always, and so maybe they don't want to hear, maybe, the nature of the edgy areas, the unknowns that we've been hearing this morning. But I've always believed that the principle of shared dilemmas is a very good one for drawing people in, for building that knowledge, because it's not, in its own way, it's no use you having all this if it isn't imparted to the broader community, which will then continue to sort of sentimentalise a lot of the old big symbols, which I know annoys you, a lot of you. So, well, that's actually not what I'm dealing with. Old Anzac symbolism and so, vital though it is, it may not equip you for the future. Now, I can also imagine a lot of politicians would be horrified at the thought of a lot of this becoming a sort of a generalised conversation, because it would reveal gaps. It would reveal where you don't feel, well, I've heard it today, where you feel that there are a lot of unknowns in this about your own ability to adapt fast enough. I can feel a sort of Greg Sheridan column coming on very fast in The Australian about some of this, but I think if we are to take the General's view of being uncomfortable, bold comfort with being uncomfortable, I really do think this could be taken to the population more than it is, if I can impart that as my view. And look, yes, there are risks in doing this, but I think it does go to that whole idea of a new social licence to operate, which may not have surrounded the military in the past quite to the extent that it does now. But my sense is that there is more of a desire among the community to hear it put like that, as a sort of a reciprocity, and I think they would give you back more. That is my real view, if you could take the risk of transmitting some of this conversation. I mean, I'll do my best to do that. We're interviewing Dr. Jack for Global Roaming this week, a little bit later today, and I'll be certainly putting some of this, but I do think it's worth considering how this might be taken to a broader population, and I think it does go to the core of the issues of trust that we've mentioned. And look, I'm not talking about straight procurement or acquisition, I'm sure you can see that. Rather a sense of conveying to the public the vital need to understand the changes that do confront good militaries. Certainly ought to confront good militaries, so that you're not caught deeply shocked by how much war had changed. In those Hackett lectures that the Chief referred me to, I noticed right back in the 60s, he quoted Arnold Toynbee, the historian, saying, talking about the terrible transformation in the character of war, which took our generation by surprise in 1914. And the rest of that is certainly history, a lot of us know about. So it's the combination, I suppose, of dramatic technological advances plus discerning how people fit into this, the paradox of this enduring nature of war amidst its ever-changing character. Now, look, I really think that that is something that the community might be ready to hear if delivered in such a way that you're prompting the discussion in this very much this learning fashion, and sharing that with the population. The motive should absolutely be greater than merely sharing of fear. And I do see, quite a lot of the commentaries from various elements, I think, well, are they just trying to terrify us? Is that what they're trying to do? I don't quite know what that yields, or does it yield a sense of gathering budget, if you see what I mean, or that serves their purpose. I really think it's got to be far more than that. And I think the offering should be from you, don't sentimentalise us, listen to our own diagnosis of self. Please, in effect, draw us, the military, into your lives by knowing how we are rethinking the nature of our service to you. We are rethinking it. Now we need you to join in that process. And then, I mean, what really hit me was that quote from Professor Hackett. What a society gets in its armed services is exactly what it asks for, no more and no less. What it asks for tends to be a reflection of what it is. When a society looks at its fighting forces, it's looking in a mirror. If the mirror is a true one, the face it sees there will be its own. So I think that is a very worthy challenge. And as we've heard, I'm not sure we're there yet. No, I don't think we are, but I think we could be if this type of the sheer character and intensity and honesty that I've heard could be transmitted more. That's certainly what I'm going to take from this, and I do really thank you all for really, really first-class conversations. But now I'm going to also go to questions because I think quite a few have come forward, but I just want to quickly do a little bit before and ask you, first of all to you, Chief, how do you assess people like you're in this big change underway. How do you assess people are wrestling with this? Are they emboldened by it, or are they honestly standing back because it all seems just a bit too demanding for their own definition of why they bothered to join?
Oh, thanks, Geraldine. That's a great question. The Regimental Sergeant Major of our Army and I have seen most of our Army in the places that they work and out in the field working alongside allies and partners over the last 3 to 4 months. We returned from that circulation around our Army having had, I think, our expectations well and truly exceeded. And what we saw were people that were very clearly connected with our purpose, connected with our mission, with a very sophisticated understanding of intent, and then demonstrating great initiative and great junior leadership to then take that intent and turn it into a reality in their part of the Army, in their call sign. And these are some pretty junior people, and their job is made more difficult by the fact that the sort of 3.5 years where we were focused on domestic humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations, whether that was COVID, floods, fires, working in aged care, driving ambulances, you name it. They were there, we were there for our community, the community we are drawn from, the community we serve in their hour of need. So they missed some of those foundational training and experience opportunities, but what they lack in experience, they more than make up for in intellect, innovation, commitment, and the conversations we had with a number of soldiers who had served in our Army between sort of 6 and 12 months were really quite profound.
So they liked having more asked of them. They liked the stand up and look further.
Yes, and I think they know that we trust them. They know at the end of the day, I can craft the most magnificent intent ever, but it's all for nothing if it's not translated into action. If I can just finish by reflecting on, and this was a consistent theme in the conversations. This is while these soldiers were digging in a defensive position after a pretty tough few weeks up at Shoulder Bay. And I asked them, what are your reflections? What have you learned from the experience? And I know for a fact this wasn't a sort of a confected response, but the themes were twofold. Firstly, I've built resilience. I've built personal and individual resilience, and that there's no shortcut to doing that. I think, for a soldier that's been in the Army for 6 months, that's a pretty profound insight. And the second one was, we've learnt a lot as a team. We can rely on one another. They fundamentally understand the importance of trust and teamwork if we're to prevail in difficult circumstances. So again, I think our people are magnificent. They're the best young soldiers and junior officers we've ever had. Our job is to build their inheritance and make sure that we are asking these kinds of questions and make sure that we are doing everything we can to set the foundations for our profession that will then allow them to reach their potential and to work, to build that resilience, work together as teams, and ultimately to prevail for the society that we represent.
Well, Jack, I just wonder, given some of that bracing material you presented from Ukraine, and particularly this, as you say, all these unusual, almost mavericks from the society surging into the forces there, whether is that appropriate to take to that very hybrid field you've described?
When a nation goes to war, it is a national act, and it comes at the expense of the nation's economy, of its social fabric, and the military really does become representative of the nation. And the question is whether the military, in absorbing all of those people, can leverage the diversity of talent and expertise in the sudden influx of people that often, prior to mobilization, the military had been desperate to try and recruit and attract to the force, but had struggled because it had been competing with the private sector. All of a sudden, the military has access to all of that talent, and yet militaries respond in a very positive way sometimes, which is to see the diversity of expertise, to see how they can leverage it and to apply it appropriately, or they try and homogenize that group. And there is a necessity to bring people into military culture and military discipline and to make them understand chains of command, procedures, processes. But when militaries essentially, and you see this sometimes, say, well, I don't care what you did in the civilian world, you'll be made to do what you need to do for the army. You might have been an engineer, but you're going to be an infantry soldier here, which you do see happen in some countries. That's a hugely destructive process. It's destructive because you have confident professionals who suddenly feel disempowered coming into the force, experienced people who don't feel they can exercise that experience, and it breaks the contract between the command and the soldiers. And so, Ukraine has really struggled with this. Its initial process of mobilization did this quite well, partly because it was not planned by the military. The military has become, it's trying to correct this now, but for a period, it was trying to avoid people being able to choose where they went when they joined. And that led to a lot of people fearing that they, as a human resource, were not going to be best used when they were mobilized, which has led to recruitment challenges for the Ukrainian military. So it's a very serious issue.
And just before so how did they get around? So people sort of felt, yes, I will offer, but I want to offer my best, and I'm not sure that you're going to. See, that's a classic sort of skepticism that is bred in you in the wider world, so how have they incorporated that into their military discipline?
Well, I think it's been a struggle. So the original process in Ukraine was that brigades managed a lot of their own recruitment. And because they were recruiting out of the communities that that brigade was based in, they often knew the people that they were pulling in. And so, the officers in the brigade would get out their Rolodex and they would talk to volunteers and they would assign people based on the personal networks that meant that they knew who they were pulling into the service. Then you had the territorial defense forces who were kind of self-mobilizing to a large extent. And so people were trying to carve out niches which encouraged them to try and show the military what they could do and therefore acquire resource. And this led to kind of the formation of these teams that were trying to solve problems. Later on, when it became a more systematic process, and mobilization teams are going around the country scouring communities, that became much more homogenous, and there was a lot more resistance. The Ukrainian state is now trying to build data on the society and leverage that data while maintaining a personal contract in terms of appropriate protections for personal data, so that the military can make informed judgments at scale about where it applies new recruits. But that is a process underway, and the Ukrainian armed forces are struggling with personnel. So it's not a resolved issue.
And General Berger, in terms of this strong culture of the Marines right down to the dogs, how do you incorporate mavericks? Clearly you need them. You need people who refresh you, who challenge you. How do you do it?
I think it doesn't happen by itself. I learned from great leaders who identified those people and pulled them up. They pulled them through the system. They supported them. Because sometimes the system will not allow them to get promoted and move their way. They get filtered out. Great leaders look layers down, identify them, and then actually pull them through, elevate them. It's not easy to do because you're moving them past artificially sometimes other people. But they're what you have to have. They're what you have to have.
Did you have to be persuaded of that? I mean, was this a sort of a realization of yours as you took more command?
I think so. I mean, the argument has to be compelling enough on its own. You can't just jam it down their throats, but you have to build acolytes, and they have to believe. They have to believe. But you have to reinforce it. They have to believe their voice matters. If they don't believe that, they won't stick around very long.
Okay, look, I could keep going, but I'm going to try to be vaguely democratic and go to your questions. Now, this is for the Chief, and this is from a questioner. What is the Australian Army doing to increase its ability to replace battlefield casualties, as Jack observed in Ukraine?
Look, that's a great question. We lack scale and mass. And throughout our history, we've sought to offset our lack of mass with technology. As Dr. Watling has sort of very comprehensively laid out for us, the application of new technologies into the prosecution of land combat offers a range of opportunities for us to effectively enter a new era of technology offset. I don't think we are ever going to be in a position, and I don't ever want to be in a position where I need to be able to, at scale, replace battle casualties. I'd rather try and get to the left of the problem and prevent. But I do think that there is a broader system, if you like, where we need to identify and build individual and institutional resilience, and to have the capacity to rehabilitate people. And we've done some deliberate things in terms of how we scale within our current force by completely changing the mission for our forces command, which is our ability to regenerate and to force generate out of contact. So in raising the unit as the division of action, our 1st Division, our 2nd Division and our Special Operations Command are committed to the theatre campaign plan, but we have retained and are building the capacity to be able to regenerate out of contact. And that's really, really important, because if you have everything committed to operations and nothing able to regenerate, I think you end up in a situation that Jack has laid out for us. So there's institutional, there is the ability to rehabilitate individuals. But coming back to your initial point, Geraldine, it's my predecessor, General Rick Burr, coined the term an army in the community and an army for the nation. That really serves to position us in relation to the society from which we are drawn, and for whom we serve. And I think that relationship and our ability to communicate is something we're very, very focused on. So that, quite frankly, we need more Australians to come and serve in their army, their navy and their air force, as well as in our space and cyber domains, to continue to make sure that the quality of life and the way of life that we enjoy and are very fortunate to enjoy in our country is something that we can hand on to future generations.
No, I take your point, and you've got to be allowed to tell this story too. I get the underlying message. Now, there's another questioner. If we have identified that there is a greater risk of moral injury on soldiers post the killing of the enemy or battle due to access of digital data, how do we adapt our training of the modern soldier? Do we desensitise them similar to the conduct of battle inoculation, or sanitise the battlefield? Jack?
I mean, this is an emerging phenomena, and therefore it's not something that we necessarily have data on. which means that especially since I'm not a psychologist, I'm somewhat cautious about prescribing what we need to do. But that's precisely why a process like a professional review, I think, is really important, because it's an area that we need to study and we need to debate and we need to discuss, precisely to determine how we make sure that we are prepared for those kinds of issues. Partly, and I think this again comes back to addressing professional military education, giving people a framework within which they can understand their actions is really important for someone's ability to justify to themselves the decisions they've made. And so the debating of ethics within professional military education, having those conversations within units is a really important way of giving people the tools to be psychologically resilient. And for people to understand the choices that they might have to confront. If it's a surprise, then the reaction may be surprising, and that's not what we want.
No, and you see, this is where I think this is very much, I think the community needs to be drawn into this sort of discussion, because I found that, completely, I did not know that. It makes sense to me, what you're bringing from the Ukraine, but I certainly didn't know it. Do you want to make any extra comment on that, General Berger?
I think when Dr. Jack talked about the first kind of time we noticed this was in UAVs. The second component of that we were not used to, didn't see coming, was those UAV operators go home at night. This is very different than the deployed unit, who, even if they have a really bad patrol, a bad firefight, they're with the people they've trained with, they're away from their family. But the UAV operator that gets off his shift and then goes home, that's hard. There's a different dynamic there than the unit that's deployed. It's a different, we were not prepared for that, no. We didn't see that coming. We may end up, in other words, looking for creative ways for that person not to go home at night, because they have to reconcile what they did during the last 8, 10 hours, 12 hours. Is that best done at home with their kids, or with a group of their peers who's thinking the same thoughts? Like, I'm not sure did we do the right thing today? I don't know. But I know that what we're doing right now is producing just what he described, a dilemma for them, who the next morning they're going to go into work and have the same thing happen all over again and then go home. We're not used to that at all. We were not prepared for that.
Maybe that one question of moral injury is not just individual but collective. Units, Margie, you're talking about solitary, it seems to me. Unit, service and national RCDVs may address components, but does national defence strategy demand a wider effort, that's our national defence strategy, demand a wider effort to address moral injury at all levels in sustained warfare? I mean, this is a terribly, particularly just some of the aftermath of the Royal Commission, just reading into that. I mean, this is obviously something that the community, I think, feels. I think the community feels this is something that probably preoccupies you all, and yet I don't find it does inside the forces. This is a very interesting difference.
Look, I guess to the heart of the question, does the National Defence Strategy, which is the policy level document, deal with that specifically? No. I don't necessarily think that's a problem. I think where we need to be focused is introspectively within the profession. We need to resolve these things, because it is our profession, and more importantly, they are our people. But in that contract of unlimited liability, as it was sort of described by Hackett, that's a reciprocal obligation, and it comes back to the relationship between the society we are drawn from and serve and those who serve. And I think you sort of very clearly identified it at the beginning, Geraldine. It's how are we communicating? So 2 of the 4 strategic priorities that I've set for our army are trust and telling our story. And by telling our story, it's about how do we better communicate with ourselves, but importantly, with the society we serve, with the government that we serve, and indeed with our allies and partners. So I think you sort of identify one of our key challenges. I think we understand it to be a challenge, and I would say we're probably, just in the foothills of how we get about doing that. Our approach is to, in a sort of a conceptual sense, is to leverage network effects. We have a phenomenal community across the country. There are 2 million Australians who have worn our uniform. We have a community today of, more than 75,000 people and families that are all around our country, connected with communities in so many ways. How do we leverage the power and the positivity of that to connect with our communities, to tell those individual stories, to humanise and personalise that contact with the society we serve? Because I think it's really important, and I think it's really important for that mutual obligation for us to have a very clear, open and honest line of communication.
Yes, I must say I was also struck by that great one line from the Hackett Lectures, quite a provocative line in its own way. Is the main purpose of the profession of arms, he said, not to win wars but to avoid them? Which, you may, in the military, you may say, oh yes, that I'm not surprised by that. Honestly, I think the broader community would say, oh really? That's a sort of an interesting, that again, a temperamental approach that I think would be very inviting for the community, you see. This is what I like to see it in a broader purpose, so that it completely gets you away from that idea that, there is a view in the broader community. Oh, odd people join. Why would they join? Why would they join something like that? Now when they've got so many options. So it's just that. I presume, Jack, this is an irrelevant discussion in Ukraine at the moment. As somebody said to me the other day, there are no culture wars and identity wars in Ukraine. when your place is, your home is at stake, all of that disappears. So it must be a very different type of conversation with the community, is it?
It's an existential one. People look at what happened in the occupied territories where the Russians went house to house, identified the people they didn't like, murdered them. Anyone who wanted to speak Ukrainian was suppressed. Their culture was destroyed. Their children were ripped away from families and taken into Russia. Parents were taken hostage and subjected to torture in order to control their families. People look at that and they appreciate what defeat means. And therefore they are willing to suffer a very great deal to preserve their dignity, their identity, their community. And so yes, when you're in that kind of existential fight, you do have a level of cohesion. But there are still very important debates in Ukraine about, plenty of Ukrainians, Russian is their first language, but in Ukraine now, the drive is to speak Ukrainian, and that has, leads to all sorts of nuanced debates about identity. There is a very active discussion in Ukraine about their future, what their nationhood means, what it should mean, their relationship with Europe, and so those conversations don't go away.
Yes, there are a lot of questions.
One point I would add as well is that the argument that you fight wars or you prepare to fight wars to prevent them is just as alive in Ukraine today as it was prior to the full-scale invasion. Because what a lot of Ukrainian soldiers will say is, I will do this so that my children don't have to. And what they want, what they are fighting for, in terms of what victory looks like for Ukraine, it's a lasting peace, with the emphasis on the word lasting, which is why they're very cautious about negotiating because they don't want a temporary peace on any terms. They want a lasting peace that means their children don't have to fight.
Pretty powerful motivation. Look, there are a lot of questions here which are along these lines. For Dr. Watling and General Berger, how do you approach... Actually, no, I want to go to the other one, rather. If the human face of battle is someone who is prepared to sign up to unlimited liability, the bloodiness of battle, the constant contact with nowhere to hide, and reputational risk, how do we possibly find enough of them? Which, before I come to you, because I mean, we're 4,400 short, but I wonder, General Berger, do you find this, is this also a big debate in the US? I must confess I don't know.
I think so, and there's a tie to recruiting that our militaries have to do also. And I think for myself, I have learned to look at this from different perspectives and different levels. At the fundamental level, in other words, for a soldier, for a Marine, why would you come in to serve in the first place? But the second, more difficult one, is this worth fighting for, is a different question than is this worth dying for? They're not the same question. And there's not the same answer at the individual or unit level than there is for the mom or dad who lost their daughter or their son. Different, same question, different answer. Because it may have been absolutely worthwhile for that Marine or the soldier, and for the parents, no. And a different response at the governmental level. It's not a simple answer, and I think our task is to understand that it's going to be, even if the question is the same, the responses, the perspectives will be very different at different levels. What we have to do then is convince teenagers who are graduating from high school, college students, why would you want to come into the military to serve? And part of that is certainly patriotism, but it's not the whole of it. They're looking for a challenge. They're looking for something they can't get somewhere else. And if we're going to keep them in our military, if we're going to retain them, we have to have the reasons why they should stay in uniform instead of getting out, because they're going to make more money on the outside. Why would you stay in? Those are not material answers. There's something else there. There's another reason.
Do you want to add to that?
I mean, why would you want to be a doctor, right? I mean, if you work as a doctor, you're going to meet lots of people who have long-term chronic problems that you're going to struggle to solve, and you're going to see the human sadness that those diseases cause. You're going to work with people who have really grim injuries, and you're going to try your hardest to save them, but often you will fail, and you will watch people die, right? And yet we don't ask that question, why would someone want to be a doctor? Because people become doctors because they want to help others. And when it comes to people serving in the military, it is service. You are serving your community by protecting them, by providing the assurance which enables their economic prosperity, their quality of life, which underpins their ambitions and their dreams. And you are also standing by to serve the community in a wide range of other ways, whether that be through enabling vaccination in war-torn countries, or, there's a whole range of ways in which military service helps others. And I think that can be a very meaningful, attractive offer. A lot of people, what they want in their professional lives is meaning and purpose. And I think the military can give that to people in spades. So I think if it's framed properly, it doesn't have to be looked at as signing up to something that is entirely grim.
Doesn't seem to be working, though, in Australia at the moment in terms of numbers.
In terms of numbers, no. And we rightly focus on those that we don't have. I would like to bring some more focus and shine some more light on those we do have, because they are serving, and service has a specific meaning. It's about putting purpose in people, or mission and mates, as we say in the Army, before oneself. And so there are tens of thousands of Australians who are serving today, some of them in an army uniform, some of them in the uniforms of our other services. There's, a couple of thousand of them wearing police uniforms outside of this building today. There are people who serve their communities for decades, putting purpose and other people first. So I don't think the idea of service is somehow a rare quality or hard to find in our society. And in my experience, people serve for two reasons. Purpose, that is, as Jack has said, being connected with something bigger than oneself. And it's not an esoteric idea, or it's about who we are as a nation, who we are as people, who we are as Australians in the 21st century. And is our way of life, our quality of life, our values, is that worth is that worth serving for in however you might serve your community? Not everybody is going to be attracted to or suited to serving in the military, but there are so many different ways you can serve our nation and our community. And I think I would like, I look at the lens of, how do we encourage people to come and join us? It's purpose, people, and pay. The pay and conditions, as General Berger said, you're not going to, potentially make as much as you would in the commercial sector. But I can absolutely guarantee that in terms of having a sense of purpose, that intrinsic sense of purpose, something that you can't buy, something that can't be taken off you, something that's with you forever, having given of yourself for others, that's a pretty powerful thing to have in life. It's a pretty valuable thing to have. And then the people that you get to work with, all of my closest friends are people I've served with, Australians and other teammates. And they're people you can trust. Ultimately, trust with your life. And I think that there's a huge value in that, in terms of the relationships, that you have in a life, in a career. And I don't think you can't find it elsewhere in other walks of life or professions, but I think it's harder to find in those areas.
Maybe part of the issue is that a lot of people simply cannot imagine that they are unsafe, that there are real threats. And especially, an island like us, I referred, there's a very good doco out called Kiss the Future, which was about the siege of Sarajevo that came out and was made last year. And what was really plain was all these sort of really cool dudes in Sarajevo, the essence of cosmopolitanism. They just simply couldn't believe that they were going to be under fire until people started dying around them, and they suddenly realised that there were somebody, namely Milosevic, had decided, with all sorts of resonances at the present day, that this was going to be their territory. And then the slow mobilisation that this was real. Nothing so real as what confronted them. So I do wonder whether that is an issue in Australia. But I also sort of feel that peace maintenance, this is my thesis, which you've no doubt thought much more. The notion of peace maintenance can be possibly served by being well equipped for what might lie ahead of you. Now, that's not, I think that's a very attractive message, actually. So that's in terms of that conversation with the society that I'm talking about. I just feel that that's something that could be considered more. No doubt you have, but that's what hits me. Look, I'm just looking at the time.
Sorry, Geraldine. I think you very eloquently described exactly the situation we find ourselves in nationally, in that we haven't really, as Australia or Australians, been touched by much of the bad things that have happened in the world since the Second World War, which touched us nationally, because almost every family, certainly every town around our country, was involved. So we were very, very fortunate. So that realisation or that understanding that, what we have is worth hanging on to, and that, that's not always guaranteed. So I think that realisation. I think if you read our defence policy, it's a very clear-eyed expression of what is at stake. So understanding what's at stake is the first piece, and then that sort of peace through strength. In other words, our national policy and strategy is deterrence by denial. But in order to deter, and deterrence is ultimately determined in the mind of its objective, you need to be relevant and credible. In other words, you rely on preserving peace on the credible ability to respond should that be required.
Quite, and that's, I find that very persuasive, though. It's also true that if in this sort of dance between technology and people, you start having the acquisition of technology as the only means to do that, I think the population says, oh, it's just more, there's never enough. And we're paying for it. So this is the tricky balancing act, I think, as to how that invitation is made. Now, look, I'm just terribly conscious of time because there's... Can we nurture the same professionalising trends among Army personnel doing offensive cyber? Or is their likely experience of the future battlefield going to be so different and perhaps so remote that they require a wholly separate set of professional and ethical tools? Fascinating question. Jack?
So I classify cyber operations in two ways. Firstly, penetrating an enemy system, and analysing it sufficiently to understand what you need to do to it, implanting an effect, and then building the command and control mechanisms to be able to initiate that effect at a time that is useful to you or your country, is a process that might take 1 to 3 years. And if the enemy patches the system, disconnects it, does something, you will lose access to that capability. And so from a military point of view, cyber effects are built up over years, but for a military commander, it's a bit like having a deck of cards, that they can play cards, but when they play the cards, they burn the capability, and the deck gets shuffled from time to time as the enemy patches the system. And so you may or you may not have that card to play the next time round. What that means is that a lot of offensive cyber operations have to be conducted in peacetime to actually lay that groundwork. And of course, the military cares about the distinction between war and peace. And so most offensive cyber operations, I think, makes much more sense fitting within the intelligence community and within their more offensive capabilities, because that's a different ethical code, it's a different moral structure. And then it's the IC supporting the military. There is now an emerging tactical cyber capability, which is how you affect systems that are not going to be patched and changed rapidly, or if they are, they're quite tactical systems, which are easy to access. That is essentially a small function supporting electronic warfare, providing EW officers with payloads for them to implant. It's useful, but to be honest, those individuals are technical specialists supporting military units, and they're trying to solve military problems. And so I think they are a core part of the military community, and they engage in similar practices with similar ethics, and are very much part of the profession.
Very interesting. Do you want to have a final word, General Burr, about that?
So there's some fair amount of discussion also in the relationship of offensive cyber specifically and deterrence. Not all developed yet, that thinking, but it's a unique aspect, in other words, of if you have a capability, you have the will to use it, and they believe you will use it, how can that contribute to deterrence, to preventing the next war or the next conflict? How much do you show your hand using the poker kind of, how much do you demonstrate that you have a capability to make them doubt, to make them think they're actually can do it and they're willing to do it? I don't know where that leads us, but it's more than war fighting. It's tied directly to deterrence. Because if you do it all in secret, they don't know you have a capability. You have to show enough, like any other military measure, you have to show them, demonstrate enough that you have a capability.
Gosh, okay. It's just I'm going to, look, loads of vital questions, and I'm incredibly grateful to the three of you for bringing all of those and for just being so eloquent in outlining them. A lot of people here sitting may well understand them better than I, but I've certainly learned a great deal, and I wonder if you could thank on our behalf our three guests, the Chief, Dr. Jack Watling.